And we are live. All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me for our January listening club. Tonight we're talking about something that we've talked about doing for a really long time, but I thought since we don't have clubs in December, January was a long enough time frame that we could do something a little bit different. So there's going to be a lot of forefront, I think, on this call as I talk about. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties from Miguel's end, but I'm going to continue on with my spiel, and hopefully they can get fixed before we actually start the conversation. All right. So this is our music listening club, but we also have two other clubs at the Dragonfly Arts. We have our movie club, which we actually had our discussion last night. We watched Rear Window, so you can go on our Facebook page or our YouTube page and catch us discussing Rear Window. This is our monthly listening club. We also have a quarterly book club, which is going to be meeting this week on Sunday at 2 p.m. A little bit of an odd time for us. We usually do these in the evening. And I just took down the poll for our next book club pick, and I will be announcing that along with our next movie and music club picks on Saturday. So you can keep an eye out for that. They will be posted in our Facebook group, which I have included the link on the page. So we don't just have these media clubs there. We also have like creative meetups, and it's also just a community of artists that come together, and you can ask for advice on things and a lot of other things. So absolutely check us out there. And if you like what we do have a Patreon. Everything that we offer is free to the public through our Facebook group. But if you like what we do, you can support us for as little as $2 a month there. We are working on trying to get some stuff together so that there will be perks. But as of right now, everything, it's just to support us. So that's that. If you are watching this on the replay, please post a comment. I still want to talk about everything. So a little bit of an explanation about what we did this time. Usually I pick an album. This is less of an album and more of a piece. So we listened to Mahler's Symphony No. 2, which is pretty much called the Resurrection Symphony. I gave everybody the link to Leonard Bernstein conducting it, but I also provided a link to a lot of other conductors, and I wanted to know for everybody on the call. Did you listen to Leonard Bernstein with the London Symphony Orchestra?
Yes.
Tim's like,
I did. I listened and watched both.
It's less of like an actual, it was just more of a curiosity thing. Did you watch any other performance or listen to any other performances?
I did, yes.
Who did you listen to?
I looked to see if Herbert von Karajan had ever conducted the second. I assumed that he did because he was known as a Mahler a fan and conducted a lot of his works, but he actually never recorded this symphony. So I went to my second choice, which is George Schulte and Chicago. Just to get comfortable with the piece to the extent that I could, because it's a very long work. And then I went and listened to Bernstein a little bit. I'm not a huge Leonard Bernstein fan. And if anybody wants to know my feelings about that and how he does this piece, I can talk about him, but it's probably beyond the scope of the conversation. Von Karajan is my go-to. George Schulte or Carl Bohm with Vienna are my second choices, but in this one I leaned on Schulte and Chicago.
All right. It was more of just a curiosity thing because composers can change the entire vibe of a piece. I did watch Leonard Bernstein. I also am not a huge fan of Leonard Bernstein. I also listened to Ozawa, and my personal favorite was Simon Rattle with the Berlin Philharmonic. I really enjoyed that one.
I've seen Maestro. Does that count?
I think the piece at the end of it is Mahler's.
It is. He does it live. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's a recording of the actual performance.
It's not. They played it live.
They played it live. Then yes.
Yeah.
You have seen the
live.
other composer.
It's also in the same cathedral.
Yeah. So I'm actually unsure where to start this conversation. There is like so much history here, and there's like so many different levels of like familiarity with it that I'm debating. I know that when we first started talking about this, I wanted everybody to listen to the full thing, but both Miguel and Tim were like, we need to only discuss the first movement. Which is interesting because the first movement is actually a standalone piece. He was unsure whether it was going to be the start of a symphony or whether it was going to just be its own song poem. So it's also 25 minutes long and has a very interesting structure for as far as like a standard symphony movement goes. I'm a huge fan of the false stop in like 3/4 of the way through. It's like there's a coda in there that just like sounds more like the ending to the piece than the actual ending, and it gets me every time.
Yeah, I gotta admit that despite my background in like playing orchestral music, this is a little out of my wheelhouse. So, yeah, I listened to it.
What was your general thought on it?
I mean, I enjoyed it. I found a lot of it reminding me of other pieces I've heard. I couldn't tell you off my top of my head which ones, but
I think John Williams lifted a lot or was inspired a lot by things in the first movement, especially.
Yeah,
yeah, no, that makes sense because some of it got me thinking Star Wars.
Exactly. Yeah, a couple of the motifs from Star Wars are like, I mean, not plagiarized, but very, very close cousins.
I always think about Jaws just being a straight lift off of New World Symphony.
Oh, is it straight?
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh, that's John Williams too, right?
What? Yeah, it is. It's also
New World is Dvorak.
Yes. Huge fan of that. I played it when I was in high school, and I have loved it since then, which is very impressive for a piece that you've actually played. I do want to just give a little bit of a overview of Mahler. Then Mahler is a Romantic period composer. He's generally pretty maximalist. I feel like cinematic is a pretty good word for his work. This specific symphony was written between 1888 and 1894. First performed in 1895 by the Berlin Philharmonic. It is called the Resurrection Symphony because it kind of explores philosophically death and resurrection and has a lot of ties into like church music. And I'm doing this all very broadly because I'm doing it from the top of my head. So absolutely, please chime in.
Yeah, I mean, the feeling that I got from it, that seems apt because it felt very much like, I don't know, like a musical adaptation, if you want to call it that, of like Dante's Inferno, like a journey through the afterlife and then like death and rebirth and, you know, all the stages of being.
It kind of is. So
is it the lyrics lifted from a poem called Resurrection? The last piece, the fifth movement.
So here's these. Yeah. Anything that has lyrics is always from a tone, like a poem. Mm-hmm. So he didn't write any of the lyrics for it. All of them are from other tone poems, which is extremely common and not at all like lifting it. It's just how things are generally done with like symphonic works and things along those lines. I put these up on the screen because if I'm remembering this correctly, the first movement is the funeral march. I know I like the third movement because the third movement is just religion means nothing. You also have the fourth movement, which is very like divine. And then the fifth movement is literally just talking about resurrection. Like, I think the lyrics for it, I think I need to pull them up. I almost put the text up on it. It literally sounds like somebody summoning zombies, and I'm a huge fan of that.
It was, I'm not going to lie, it was a little jarring until it gets to the end and it kind of like builds into this like, like grand ending. But like, and the ending, like the ending of the whole symphony. I love when pieces end that way, where it's like this big, huge buildup and like it's all dramatic. And then it's just cuts and then mom, like quiet. I love that.
I think it's also important to know about Mahler that he kind of has like a really terrible childhood and just in general a very tragic life. And I feel like that plays a huge part in a lot of his music. He's kind of got Edgar Allan Poe vibes. A very, very tragic figure. I think all of his family died when he was pretty young. And
I did appreciate. Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
Thinking out loud. I did appreciate all of the oboe and English horn involvement.
A lot of oboes, a lot of instruments.
Because those are my instruments, and you don't see a lot of English horn being used, which also brought it back to Star Wars again because I played the English horn solo in the Darth Maul theme in high school. In that, English horn is a fun instrument. It's basically just a giant oboe.
The amount of horns used in this, Vinny, is just bonkers to me.
Oh, and that thing, the choreography where he has them lift him up.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty awesome.
The fact that there are like between 3 and like 5 instruments for each of these guys just off stage for one movement is hilarious. I also know that Mahler like wrote down the amount of time he wanted people to wait between each movement so that people had time to reflect between them. He put
really?
a lot of thought process into
That
this,
sounds
but also
really uncommon. Do any other composers do that?
I don't think so. Not that I know of.
I don't know that he did it for all the movements. I think he just did it between the first movement and the second movement.
I think he did it for the first and the second, but I do know that like some other conductors have changed it, and he had mixed feelings on that.
I think I'm sorry. I think he specified 5 minutes, and conductors have found ways to work that in without, taking the full 5 minutes usually, or just finding a way to work that in as seamlessly as they can.
Or
Seriously,
just not
like
do it
5
at all.
minutes?
Yeah.
Jeepers.
Look, it's a funeral. You need time to reflect before you talk about
sit
this
around doing
person's
nothing at a
life.
funeral, jeepers, for 5 minutes. Plus your family's around. Wow.
5 minutes as an audience member is a very long time.
Very long time.
Yeah, I mentioned the oboe parts because I can't tell you how many pieces I played that had no part written for oboe. So we always just played the flute part, and that was boring. So I always appreciate it when they put in an actual part.
A lot of things from this time because English horn was very, very common. So this was like a kind of melding period when like English horn and oboe were used in mixed usage.
Yeah, English horn not quite as common anymore.
Yeah. You guys were so excited to talk about this, and I've been hoping that you guys bring up a topic just because I am just going to. I know music history, so
I'm
just here for the ride, man.
Rebecca, I've got a couple things.
All right, let's hear them.
So we were, the first is, we talked about it sounding cinematic, and I wonder if, there's a chicken or the egg thing. So I came very late to Mahler, and I was actually scared of Mahler after I read the C.G. Ozawa book, because he described him as completely crazy, and I'm like, I don't know if I can deal with this. But it does sound cinematic to me. But my sense of that, just as a layperson and not having listened to a lot of it, is that it seemed like he had a really heavy influence on a lot of film composers. So not just John Williams lifting from him, but it just seems like that the reason this music didn't seem strange and crazy to me like it did to C.G. Ozawa in the 60s was because this is what film scores are like,
That's actually a fair point of, which came first. I do think even within this time frame, Mahler was very heavy in like the images and like philosophy that he was putting forth. It's very all encompassing. He's very into. He kind of smothers you with music in a way, and then like you feel the release almost. It's
a lot.
It's a lot.
But it's cool. I liked it a lot more than, and like I said, I haven't listened to a whole lot before this. But I liked it a lot more than I thought, because again, I was thinking of C.G. Ozawa talking about the structure being crazy and all this crazy stuff happening. I'm like, I can barely handle classical music. So that was one thing. And the other thing was, I was surprised that he composed it and it was debuted in the 1800s. And I know it's very late 1800s, because I was thinking this is kind of like, there are romantic elements, but I thought it was more 20th century than romantic. And again, I'm saying that as not at all an expert or a musicologist when it comes to classical music. But if you'd have told me, that this was composed 20 years ago, I would have gone for that. I was like, yeah, this is crazy enough to, so anyway, so even though there's definitely romantic elements, I think he's definitely foreshadowing the 20th century in a heavy way.
Oh yeah. The 20th century music started with so much like dissonance that this is like a precursor of. I'm trying to, because he like wrote at the same time as a lot of people that had that same vibe for it, but I do know that like he moved on to like Alban Berg and Webern and Schoenberg, who also are all well known for like their dissonance, and like it's almost this ability to push the boundaries of where things are going. He inspired a lot of people to push a lot of boundaries that made a lot of people very mad.
But of all the, and I've only listened to those people that you mentioned, only some of them and only a little bit. He's way more listenable for me personally than that, because there's real strong melodic sense that I think a lot of the 12-tone folks and 20th century folks kind of set aside for a while.
I think Mahler walked so that they could run in a way when it comes to that. Tim.
I'm holding up my hand because I keep getting muted. Am I echoing right now?
Not right now.
No, it's when other people talk, we can hear it through your speaker.
Oh, okay. I find it interesting that everybody is feeling about it being modern, because I hear Beethoven all throughout, all throughout. I also hear things that later composers, I hear a lot of Dvorak, which probably means I'm hearing folk kind of music in this piece as well. But the overwhelming thing, and I did some looking into that, and I read other writers suggesting, that they hear Beethoven in the vocal part, and yet that's the one place where I don't really hear Beethoven. I hear it in his, that opening motif in the bass and the cellos. That's so Beethovenish, and that false ending that you talked about, that's almost lifted right out of the second movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And so these very dramatic things are very Beethovenish. And then I hear the stuff that, he passed down to other composers, particularly Dvorak was the thing that really stood out in my mind. But he never struck me in this work. Mahler's always been a big blind spot for me. I tried getting in with the First Symphony many years ago, and I tried the Eighth Symphony, and I was kind of excited that you chose this one because it forced me to actually work at listening to Mahler and trying to grasp. And this first movement in and of itself, people have suggested that it's modified sonata form, and I think that's being very generous in his definition of sonata, because while he does do exposition and development and recapitulation, he does it not in any fashion that seems tied down to what all composers to this point considered sonata form. It probably took me 2 or 3 weeks of listening just to be able to figure out where the sections were, because this is not just your typical first movement, as you and I had discussed earlier when I said we should just do the first movement, is that this is a symphony within a symphony, this first movement, and that it's marked as an allegro. It's an allegro for maybe 20% of the piece.
I love that it's an allegro, and you probably have this on the score, but the first thing it says is with complete gravity and solemnity of expression. And I'm like, that's not what you write at the start of an allegro. What are you talking about, man? But it is sonata form. It's just that nothing is what it sounds like it should be. Well, it's like forming a sentence with all the parts, but none of the parts.
He uses most composers, will take a limited number of melodic ideas and explore those. They'll show them up in the exposition, they'll explore them in the development. But he seems to be grabbing every frickin' melodic motif that he can and doing something with it. And one thing that I've never really heard any other composers do is he takes that first melodic line from the cellos and the bass, and he marks out sections of the entire first movement, and it's almost like he's doing like a 4-act feature film. He's got the first section, and then he divides the development section, I think, into 2 sections, and then he does the recapitulation as a 4th section, which is after the false start, or the false ending that you talk about. That's when he does the recapitulation, is after that. But everything up to that is the development section and the exposition before that. But I think that's it. Once I realized that that's how he was sort of dividing up this first movement, I was able to kind of get a better sense of where everything was, and it became easier once I identified that.
To be clear, it's kind of just going between A, B, A, B, and then like with a little transition in between. Because there were a lot of terms in there. Did that help at all?
I only got to where I was able to listen to the whole piece, including the other 4 movements, and understand where I was within the piece as a whole. I only got to that place yesterday, and I've been listening to this piece over and over again since you first announced it. And I just spent most of the time with the first movement, but I gradually worked in. And I say this as a suggestion, if for people who want to I think this is a hard piece for people that don't normally listen to European art music because of the amount of stuff that Mahler has put into it. And so I think you kind of need to take it a bit at a time before you'll be able to listen to it. I still can't listen to it in the way like I listened to, for example, Beethoven's Ninth. I know that piece like the back of my hand, and I always know where I am. And that ability to do that came very easily for me. I had to work the shit out of this to get to where I knew what was going on at all. This is a very difficult work.
You're also coming at it from a different angle than a lot of people. I like introducing people to Mahler because I think he's very listenable and while being interesting. But to understand it, you do need to learn, like do a little bit of reading on Mahler. So I'm trying to give basic background on this as we go through the discussion. I think even going into the piece and listening to it and knowing that he's talking about the philosophy of afterlife and resurrection and death really helps and can set the mood for it, because it does sound very modern in a lot of ways because a lot of people have taken from it, but also it plays a lot on a lot of older models of things. It's a lot of church music. And it's also, I wonder if the reason why the first movement is so weird in terms of like its structure is because he did intend for it to be its own individual piece, and then he reworked it in some way for a symphony, and so it just kind of ended up in this weird middle ground of form. This is also a very long symphony.
I was just going to say, I was very impressed by the stamina that it takes to do this entire thing. Like, just, as a woodwind player, to go through a full hour and a half of straight, with no breaks, practically. I mean, you've got, rests and things like that. But, and then the way that he conducts is also, not he, but like, the way that Bernstein conducts is very energetic, very animated. And just doing that for an hour and a half straight seems like a lot.
I have a lot of respect for the stamina of conductors, but also for this piece, I have a lot of respect for the stamina of the horn players.
Yeah.
This piece is so horn heavy. And I actually find that the difference when I'm listening to the like different conductors conducting the piece is how hard they treat the horns. If that makes sense. Like some people, like the woodwinds and the brass will be on like the same plane, and some of them will be like really, really off.
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't a horn player. I mean, as far as oboe goes, it's probably the least energy expending of most of the wind instruments. So, because you don't need a lot of air.
Yeah.
As opposed to flute.
Oh yeah, as opposed to flute. Yeah. Hey, Rebecca, I wanted to just amplify one thing you said, that I did think this is really listenable, even though it's 90 minutes long, and just for the sheer length. I'm not like, say, my daughter's really into film music, but she never heard Mahler. I might not start with this just because it's 90 minutes. You know what I mean? Might start with the leader or something. But I totally agree with that. And I wanted to bring up something that Tim reminded me of when he said he was looking for Karajan versions of this. So one of the things I learned from the C.G. Ozawa book that was really interesting is that Mahler was not in the repertoire of the vast majority of orchestras until the 60s. And it was when Bernstein went through the trouble of recording all of the Mahler symphonies with the New York Phil, which I think was early 60s, maybe some of it was late 50s. Most orchestras were scared of it, right? Like they just thought it was overall too technically challenging. You know what I mean? And so for, I don't know when he died, but for a good number of decades after he died, he wasn't in the orchestral repertoire. And I thought that was really interesting. And then all of a sudden, Bernstein, through his performances, not only with the New York Phil, but with other and advocating for Mahler, sort of it got it to the point where nowadays people aren't that frightened of it like they were back in the 50s and 60s, like thinking it was too technically challenging. And then going back to Tim's thing, I had read in the C.G. Ozawa book that, and I could be remember this wrong, but Karajan had only recorded one symphony and a lot of the leader. And he wasn't really doing Mahler, at least at the time that Bernstein started recording it. And the reason the Bernstein's recordings of Mahler are in C.G. Ozawa's book is that Ozawa was one of the assistant conductors for Bernstein at that time.
On a note about his music not being played, he did descend into, like, he died and nobody really played it. And then he is Jewish. And so after the Nazi Party took over, they banned his music, so nobody could play his music. It was actually Leonard Bernstein that claims that he brought about the revitalization of Mahler. I'm always shocked by how few people know about Mahler, like outside of like the music world and like classical music especially. Mahler is not a super common name that people bring up.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, if you're doing music education classes for kids, and you're not going to start with Mahler, you're going to start with the more accessible, like a nice Copland symphony, maybe some Bach, but yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you could also say the same thing about Webern. I don't think any of those composers who were contemporaries of Mahler really are very well known outside of music people. And you could say the same thing for, a lot of the Russian Five, in the late previous century. Everybody knows Tchaikovsky because they love the Nutcracker Suite, and they like Rimsky-Korsakov because they know Scheherazade, but they don't know Borodin. They might know Mussorgsky because they saw Fantasia and they love Night on Bald Mountain. But I think a lot of those composers, everybody knows Beethoven, everybody knows Mozart, but once you get into that transition-y era of the late 19th century, early 20th century, it's kind of a gaping hole with some very small exception, particularly American composers. You have Copland, most obviously among the American composers that most people know, but he was working with a lot of American folk music in his melodies, which is one of the reasons why Dvorak is so well loved, because he was working with American folk melodies as well, despite not being an American.
I think that probably has to do with the shift in pop culture and how the listening of music changed. And like, if you were not a composer getting featured in like a film, like, outside of music people going to see orchestral concerts, like there wasn't a lot of exposure at that point.
It is important to note that like music at this time, there basically was the composer community, and then everybody else involved in it were just socialites that wanted to say that they were there. That's why concert halls and a lot of opera houses have seats that are like on either side of the stage where you can't actually sit anybody anymore, because it was never about watching the opera. It was about being able to afford a ticket. And so especially like around the turn, like the start of the 20th century, like end of the 19th, start of the 20th century, you have like a lot of weird disconnect there that I really, really love, that Mahler is kind of involved in the sense of he hung out with all those dudes. All these dudes that were writing pieces that were so dissonant and so out there that it caused like mass hysteria in hilarious ways. Like, honestly, if you ever want like have an interest in music history, I think this is the best time frame for it, because it's hilarious. Yeah. It's a bunch of socialites who know nothing about music getting offended about music.
So what year, when was he born? When was he active, and when did he die?
Let me find out on Wikipedia. He was active around this time frame. I want to say that he died in like 1910. But, he was born in 1816 and he died in 1911. So he was finishing his 10th symphony when he died.
Wow. He lived a long life.
Wasn't he working in New York for a while? Wasn't he doing something with the New York Phil, if not conducting the New York Phil?
He
I
was
might be
briefly a
remembering that.
director
The director. What does the
of the
director do?
Met and the Phil. Usually they pick out the music, is my understanding. Yeah.
How long did he live in the States? Do you have that access to that?
I do not know off the top of my head, and I don't really want to go reading through
No.
Wikipedia
I'm
to find out.
just curious,
Um,
like if he spent a significant amount of time in the States or just a little. I'm not aware.
Probably just a little, if I mean less than a decade for sure.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
You had mentioned before about Mahler kind of disappearing and relating that to what was going on in Germany at the time, and that I think affected a lot of composers, particularly European. Hitler and his folk had this thing that they classified modern music as degenerate music. And you can and a lot of times, particularly here in Los Angeles, we'll have concerts at like Walt Disney Hall and in other venues where they do programs of the band music at the time. And it wasn't just music composed by Jewish folk, but anything that had that modern tinge that was was not a throwback to Romantic and classical eras. And that probably had a large effect on how people were able to hear modern music to the extent that they could, until, as you say, Bernstein made Mahler popular. And I think we start to see around that same time that people start listening to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, or the works of Weber and the other composers. And finally after the war, we make that room for John Cage starts doing stuff, and later following on him, Philip Glass and Steve Reich, and we get all these different kinds of sounds that don't seem to be connected to the Romantic and classical traditions that everybody, or the Baroque tradition even, that everybody's much more familiar with.
I hear a dog walking.
Just
I
walking
definitely need to turn down the
paces.
volume some more. I have to trim Polly's nails.
She's just doing paces in the background, just waiting for something.
I think she wants to be fed, probably.
That's fair. I'm trying to think, because this is like a very complex piece, and I wasn't sure where this discussion was going to go. An interesting first classical piece for sure. This was suggested by Miguel. And I definitely think it's something that is accessible from a listening point of view, in the sense of it's interesting. It makes you feel things.
Yeah, that, and it feels very reminiscent of what, is more accessible in today's classical world, which is, or people who, would know of classical within pop culture being like, people who watch movies, film score, things like that.
I mean, once you get past the first movement, the rest of the piece, the other four movements, which usually in a symphony, it's just four movements. He goes to full five movements. It starts to sound more like a traditional, or tradition with some, with the use of adding the use of vocals in, and that kind of thing. There are some differences, but mostly, for the most part, you can look at the rest of the work as a typical, the typical organization of a symphony. It's just that long first movement that just is, it's just so radically different from what we're used to in a symphony.
Well, I'm not used to much in symphonies, so I don't have a point of reference.
Well, yeah, but even from that point of reference of not knowing what I think makes this so challenging is simply the number of different melodic ideas that Mahler explores in the first movement. It's just I think it's very hard to keep track I will always go back to Beethoven because he was very concise in this matter. The first movement of the Ninth Symphony, every movement of the Ninth Symphony is very easy to follow because Beethoven works with a very limited set of melodic ideas, and then he explores the shit out of those ideas and then comes back to that. Mahler is just, as I said before, he's just, oh, that, yeah, we'll stick that here. Oh, yeah, let's put that here. And then we'll come back to the cello and the bass thing, and then we'll come back here and we'll do this here. It just, I almost want to say the word confusing, but that implies that you have a set place to start from, that you understand a form that this is how it should sound. And I had to get rid of all of my preconceptions about what is a symphony, what is a movement from a symphony, before I could appreciate all the stuff that was going on. I mean, it wore me out the first couple times I listened just to that first movement.
I mean, he's a maximalist. All of his pieces, he's a maximalist.
Yeah. And Tim, I would say, having read the Seizi Ozawa book, that was his reaction at first too. Like, he just thought, this is crazy. This makes no sense. This is all over the place. I don't know how to understand this, you know?
That's
and
interesting.
Even the guy who interviewed him had the same reaction. The Japanese novelist, Murakami, he listens to a ton of music, and he had a lot. Took him a long time to get his mind around Mahler. I'm sorry, Becca, I stepped on you. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. I had interrupted you first. No, but I think it's interesting, the kind of dichotomy in experience where you guys are both talking about how complex it is, and I'm like, no, it's actually really relatable. Having no no experience in listening to symphony and picking up these things,
which is why I like introducing people to Mahler. Like, not just this, but his work in general, is when some people are like, oh, I want to listen to classical music or something. I'm like, well, here's some dope stuff. Just don't think too hard about it.
Well, and I think it is in that way accessible to a broader audience, because it's not your typical, what I have found challenging about listening to classical music in the past is that it all sounds the same. And how, you were saying, Tim, how they explore the same melodic, themes over and over, and, for long periods of time. And it gets boring to me being a, someone who's not versed in that world, and a child of the 80s or of the 21st century, I guess. And so just, not having that background, I find it interesting and also enjoyable to listen to without any underlying critique to that.
Yeah, and I think my reaction was similar to Becca's. I hadn't listened to a lot of Mahler outside of the fifth movement of this that's in the Maestro movie. So listening to the whole thing, it was sort of like, well, this is it didn't seem as strange as what I had read about.
I think there's also a different by the time we get to Mahler, there's a much more expensive idea of melody, because when you said Beckett, about how it all sounds the same and it's boring, again, that depends on, I think for most people, depends on the composer. I mean, you put a piece of Mozart in somebody's ears, and Mozart is such a master at melody, probably the greatest master of melody ever. Because of that, Mozart is extremely accessible for most people, I think, and just about every piece, just because he's so good with melody. And I think one of the reasons that Beethoven works as well, because he was also very much not anywhere near Mozart, because for melody, nobody can really touch Mozart, but he's working with kind of within the same kind of conception of what a melody is. By the time we get to Mahler, the idea of what is a melody is changing. I think one of the things that grounds Mahler's work, at least here, because again, I haven't really been able to penetrate him, is the extent that he connects to folk music in his slower melodies. And that's always a great way to catch the ear, because folk melodies depending on the culture that you're drawing from, folk melodies are relatively easy to grasp and take you into the piece. So, you know, there's an interesting thing that Von Karajan did, and I think that's why he did not ever record this symphony. Whenever he was approaching a new piece, and Ozawa talks about this. I haven't read Ozawa's book, but I know he's talked about it in interviews, is that Von Karajan would sit down on his floor and he would spread the score out in front of him. And he would do what he called trying to find his way into the music. And if he could not find his way into that piece of music, he would not perform that piece. And I think that's kind of the way. I'm not performing these pieces, but if I can find a way into a piece of music, it will be a piece that I will listen to over and over again. And Mahler, again, as I said, Mahler, this piece, being the only thing I've ever penetrated, I had to actually, and I put in the work. That's why I was happy for this challenge, because it made me put in the work to find all the wonderfulness that's in here. And I'll go on to other pieces, but and I don't know if other listeners do that as well when they're approaching a piece of European art music, if they try to find their way into the music, and if they do, then they will listen to that piece. But it seems like perhaps maybe that might be a way a lot of people do that, knowingly or unknowingly.
Sorry, there was a lot in there.
That was a lot of honest.
There was a lot going on there, so I'm just trying to process.
I have an unrelated thought.
Go for it.
I really love this portrait of him on the right with the sketch tuxedo.
Yeah, so this was done by a guy named Emil Orlich, and I am a huge fan of it, which is why I included it. I was like, they have to see this really cool piece.
Is he contemporary of Mahler's?
I think so. Yeah, I think this was done while watching him. But honestly, I have no idea.
Is the whole portrait a sketch, or is that a photo and superimposed on a sketch?
The photo, it's a photo of Mahler and then the sketch of Mahler. So these are
I'm talking about the one. Yeah, the one on the right.
It's a full sketch.
Oh,
so it's a sketched outline, and then it looks like it's shaded, probably in like charcoal.
Is it just me, or does he look a little bit like Bob Geldof in that sketch?
Do not know who that is.
Oh,
a little bit.
We are the world.
Probably mostly the hair.
Well, then I like it even more, knowing that it's a drawn sketch and not a photo superimposed on a sketch.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing.
So are you inspired to listen to more Mahler? Or has Tim
yes,
scared
I am.
you?
I have a funny Mahler story, if we have time.
Yeah.
So
we are coming up on an hour, so I want to make sure that everybody got all their thoughts out.
So I'll do two things really quickly. So first, I had two drumming buddies who thankfully didn't lose their houses in the fires. One of them taught classical percussion at USC, and so I'm at his house, and I'm saying, dude, you know, I need to learn about Mahler. I turned him on to, we did a listening party. I turned him on to Radiohead. He turned me on to Mahler, right? Seems fair. So when he's going through all of his Mahler CDs, he's going, and he was going to do the Titan, which is the first one, right? Anyway, so he's going through all these CDs he's got of the Titan, and then he's going, I don't know. And then he picks one. He goes, oh, no, I'm on that one. And then he skips it. And I'm like, oh, dude, we're listening to that one right now because you're on it. So that was my introduction to Mahler by a guy playing me some Mahler that he was on. And then the last thing I wanted to do really quickly is just to give Leonard Bernstein some love, because he's one of my favorites. And I realized he's done a lot of film music, like On the Town and On the Waterfront. And I love the symphonic dances from West Side Story, if I don't love so much the singing versions. But like growing up, the people that taught me were huge into Copland and Bernstein, and the more obscure Bernstein, the better. So I'm a huge fan. So
yeah, I'm not here for the Bernstein hate. West Side Story is my favorite musical. So
one of the things that I really appreciate about Bernstein is that he was the guy who got Americans to appreciate modern music. He introduced a lot of composers that Americans might not have heard if not for him. And he used his bully pulpit to get Americans to listen to tougher, more interesting music that wasn't just based on, that wasn't romantic, classical, or Baroque.
Mahler, for example. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he's done 2 TV series that are some of the best music education anywhere. There was what was the name of the Harvard lectures, the Norton lectures?
Yeah.
And the Omnibus TV show. There is no better music video teaching on the planet. You got to watch it. And he does a great video about the connection between the language of a country and the rhythms of its folk music and how that all works together. Going back to your thing about folk music with Dvorak and others. But yeah, he's just like, I think he would be famous just as a teacher if he didn't compose and conduct.
I was thinking about Mahler's influence, and there's a great when Akira Kurosawa was finishing up Ron, or while he was in production, his composer Toru Takemitsu, he had asked him to score this battle scene, and he wanted to score it differently than most battle scenes were filmed, and he asked Takemitsu to compose something Mahler-like. And the name of the piece is called Hell's Picture Scroll. I think you can find it on YouTube and any of the any of the streaming sites. Takemitsu is probably one of my all-time favorite composers. He melds European classical music with traditional Japanese ideas, and the Ron soundtrack is stunning, and I think it will blow you away. Watch it on YouTube so you can actually watch the scene. And the name of the piece from the score is Hell's Picture Scroll, and is absolutely, it's so moving. It's probably one of the most moving battle scenes you'll ever watch, just because of the way Takemitsu scores it. And that was all because Kurosawa said, compose me something Mahler-like for this sequence.
Yeah.
Fair.
Mahler-esque is a thing.
Ron has been on my list of movies to watch for a very long time that I just have not.
I wrote it in the comments.
All right, I'll put it in the comments. It's a long film. It's well worth it.
I wrote the name of the piece you're talking about in the comments for reference.
It's Kurosawa's adaptation of Shakespeare's King Lear.
Yes.
I think it's Kurosawa's masterwork. I also think it's Takemitsu's masterwork as well. Just such a great film. It's one of my favorite scores.
All right, so we are coming up on an hour. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add about Mahler or the symphony?
What's everybody's next Mahler work they're going to listen to?
I'm going to go through all the Bugs Bunny cartoons to see if they did any Mahler like they did the Wagner. That's a joke.
They might have.
They did a couple of Rossini's. Bugs Bunny covered Barber of Seville, and he also covered the William Tell Overture.
Well, there you go. And yeah, and they killed a wabbit, of course. Yeah, this was awesome. Maybe we should do Ram in the film. What do you call it?
Oh, for movie club. Maybe
I was
I
trying
haven't
to see
picked
what
something
streaming
yet,
service
so.
it's on. Tim, do you have a DVD of it, or did you?
I own it on Blu-ray.
I don't think it's on a streaming service. What the heck?
If it was, it would probably be on Criterion.
All right, I'm going to end the call here before we get too off topic of talking about things that we might possibly watch in the future. So thank you guys for joining me, and thank you for listening, and I hope to catch you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.